When Dr. Elias Cross, a successful black surgeon, arrives in the small town of Millstone to build a medical center, he's met with hostility and resistance. A corrupt deputy mayor and a racist police officer target him with harassment, false accusations, and public humiliation, determined to push him out and protect their control over the town. As Elias uncovers a system built on prejudice and abuse of power, he faces escalating injustices that expose the deep-rooted racism in America. This infuriating story highlights the battles faced by those who challenge discrimination and demand accountability. Malik Owen stepped out of his sleek black SUV, the sound of the car door closing reverberating through the quiet street. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the familiar rows of modest houses and cracked sidewalks. As he took in the neighborhood where he had spent his childhood, a wave of nostalgia mixed with something heavier: unease. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, feeling a stark contrast between his polished image now and the boy who used to run down these same streets in grass-stained sneakers. Kids laughed in the distance, their shouts echoing off old brick buildings, but the streets felt emptier than he remembered. This place had seen better days. Boarded-up shops stood as grim reminders of the businesses that had once thrived. Graffiti marked walls that used to be pristine, and the park at the end of the block, once a hub of laughter and life, lay abandoned, weeds overtaking its rusty swings. This was the neighborhood he had promised himself he'd give back to. Malik was here to fulfill that promise. "Let's get this started," he muttered under his breath, striding toward the community center's construction site. A small group of residents had already gathered by the chain-link fence, their murmurs barely audible over the rumble of machinery inside. Some watched him with cautious eyes. Others folded their arms, their distrust plain as day. A middle-aged man stepped forward. His face was weathered, his hair thinning, but his posture radiated authority. Malik recognized him immediately. Mr. Ron Baker, the head of the local homeowners association. "You're a bit overdressed for a construction site, don't you think?" Ron's voice was loud, and the words carried a tinge of mockery that cut through the air. Malik smiled faintly, choosing not to rise to the bait. "Good to see you too, Mr. Baker. Thought I'd dress for the occasion. It's not every day you see change in the making." "Change?" Ron scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "That's one word for it, others might call it trouble." Malik's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice measured. "This project will breathe life into the neighborhood, a state-of-the-art community center, job opportunities, a place for kids to learn and grow." Ron chuckled darkly, turning to address the growing crowd behind him. "Jobs for who? You think these kids need a shiny new building, or do they need someone who understands what they're up against, someone who won't waltz in here with promises they can't keep?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Malik felt the tension in the air thicken, the hostility barely hidden beneath polite stares. He glanced at the faces, people he had known as a child. Old friends, their parents, new residents he didn't recognize. He wanted to reach them, to explain. But Ron's voice drowned him out. "You don't belong here anymore, Malik. We've seen what happens when outsiders meddle. It never ends well." The word, outsider, hung like a slap in the face. Malik felt a fire flare in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. He met Ron's stare evenly. "I'm not an outsider. This is my home too." Ron stepped closer, his smile cold. "Not anymore." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Malik realized Ron's words were spreading doubt, infecting the group like poison. He scanned the faces for an ally, someone who remembered who he really was. But all he saw were wary gazes and walls built on years of mistrust. This wasn't going to be easy. And Ron Baker was only just getting started. The morning light broke gently through a thin layer of clouds, spilling across the streets of Millstone, a small southern town whose charm was as unassuming as it was deceptive. Rows of vintage shops, diners, and faded brick storefronts stretched down Main Street, their peeling paint whispering stories of a bygone era. Cars rolled lazily through the town, and for the most part, life moved at the pace of molasses, slow, steady, and uninterested in change. Dr. Elias Cross leaned against his black Chevy Suburban, parked near a quiet corner of the street. At 43, Elias was a man of undeniable presence. He wasn't tall or imposing, but something about the way he carried himself, calm, steady, unshakable, made people sit up straighter in his company. He wore a well-tailored charcoal suit with no tie, and his polished oxblood loafers hinted at elegance without ostentation. The neatly trimmed beard framing his sharp jawline made him look distinguished. But it was his eyes, a deep, unwavering brown, that revealed the full weight of a life spent building something from nothing. Elias was a man who belonged to two worlds. In one, he was a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, known for saving lives others deemed unsalvageable. His name carried weight in boardrooms and operating rooms alike. He was published, celebrated, and had been approached more than once to lead some of the largest medical institutions in the country. But in the other world, the one that mattered most to him, Elias was simply Eli, a man who had come from streets like these, a man who remembered every broken promise made to communities like his. And now, as his reputation swelled, so did his commitment to give back. Quietly, relentlessly. Today, he was back in Millstone, though no one here knew him by name or face. It had been years since Elias had walked through these streets, and while his face had grown unfamiliar to the town, its whispers of prejudice had not. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, taking in the town square, where a bronze statue of a Confederate soldier still stood defiantly atop a stone pedestal. Below it, plaques listed names, none of which resembled his. The world had a funny way of reminding him of where he stood. No matter how many hearts he mended, or lives, he changed. "Morning, Dr. Cross," came a soft voice behind him. Elias turned to see David Wright, his driver and assistant of 8 years, holding out a plain black leather bag. David, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, had been Elias's quiet rock for as long as he could remember. "You sure you don't want me coming in with you? Folks here can be—" David paused, searching for the right word, though Elias already knew what he meant. "Folks here can be folks," Elias replied with a wry smile, waving off the offer. "I'll be fine, David. I'm just a man getting breakfast, no harm in that." David's face tightened with hesitation, but he handed over the bag anyway. "You call me if you need me." "I won't need you," Elias said confidently, though his tone carried an edge of resolve. He patted David's arm, before walking toward the diner across the street. The Sugar Hill Diner had stood on the same corner of Millstone for decades, a relic of another time with its chipped red booths and checkered floors. The windows fogged slightly from the heat of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee. Elias pushed the door open, the small brass bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the diner bustled with a small crowd of locals, farmhands in worn denim jackets, families with syrup-sticky kids, and older men hunched over steaming mugs of coffee. Conversations hummed low, weaving into the gentle clatter of silverware and the hiss of the griddle. Elias paused just inside the door, observing the space as if he were cataloging it for a patient evaluation. The floors were scuffed, the walls yellowed, and the air carried the faint scent of frying oil that never truly left. He liked places like this. Simple, unpretentious. They reminded him of home. The waitress behind the counter caught his eye, her blonde ponytail swishing as she glanced up with a distracted smile. "Morning, Hunsie, at yourself, I'll be right with you." Elias offered her a polite nod and made his way to a booth in the far corner, settling his bag beside him. His eyes scanned the room as he waited. He wasn't searching for trouble, but experience had taught him to read a room carefully. Old habits die hard. It didn't take long to notice the glances. Subtle at first. Quick flicks of the eyes from the men sitting at the counter. A murmur passed between them, their voices too low for Elias to catch. He turned his attention to the window, watching as a young mother scolded her toddler for smearing jam on the glass. He smiled faintly, recalling his sister doing the same to him when they were kids. A shadow fell across his table, pulling him from the memory. Elias looked up to see a man standing there. A wiry figure with sunken cheeks and suspicious eyes. The man wore an oil-stained cap and a faded flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose forearms lined with veins and calluses. "You lost?" the man asked flatly. Elias raised an eyebrow, his expression measured. "Excuse me?" "You ain't from around here?" the man said, his tone bordering on accusatory. "Folks don't usually stroll into Sugar Hill dressed like—" His gaze flicked over Elias's suit jacket and loafers. "That." Elias sat back in his seat, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "I didn't realize there was a dress code." The man snorted, his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ain't no code, just don't see folks like you round here much." "Folks like you." The words settled heavy in the air, unspoken meaning hanging between them like smoke. Elias held the man's gaze, unblinking. "I'm just here for breakfast." "Yeah, well, maybe you oughta. Charlie." The waitress's voice cut through the moment, sharp and disapproving. She stood behind the counter with a coffee pot in hand, glaring at the man. "Quit harassing my customers and sit yourself down." Charlie shot her a look, muttered something under his breath, then gave Elias one last glare, before turning on his heel and stomping back to the counter. The waitress appeared moments later, pouring a steaming cup of coffee into the mug in front of Elias. "Sorry about that," she said with an apologetic smile. "Charlie's harmless, just doesn't know how to mind his own business." "No harm done," Elias replied smoothly, though the tension still hung in his shoulders. "You looking to order something or just coffee?" she asked, flipping open her notepad. Elias glanced at the menu tucked between the ketchup and sugar packets. "The eggs, bacon and grits, please." "You got it," she said, scribbling the order and walking off with a practiced efficiency. As Elias sipped his coffee, he could feel eyes still on him. Charlie's mostly, but others too. Small-town suspicion ran deep. Outsiders weren't welcome unless they looked the part, and no matter how many suits Elias owned or how many surgeries he performed, to them, he would always be something different. When the plate of food arrived, Elias ate slowly, methodically, savoring each bite. It was good, better than he'd expected, but the meal was secondary to why he was here. This town, this place, it was a test. A quiet test of his patience, his resolve. Elias didn't have to be here, he could have sent a team or a lawyer, but some fights, he'd learned, had to be fought in person. He wiped his mouth with the napkin, drained the last of his coffee, and left a $20 bill beneath the empty mug. As he stood to leave, he felt Charlie's eyes follow him once more, burning into his back like a warning. "Safe travels," Charlie called, his voice laced with thinly veiled sarcasm. Elias paused at the door, one hand on the handle. He turned back to look at Charlie, his face calm, but his tone deliberate. "Take care now." The bell above the door jingled softly as Elias stepped outside into the pale morning sun. He could feel it already, the quiet conflict brewing beneath the surface, a challenge that had yet to be named. This wasn't over. Elias stepped back onto the street, the morning sun warmer now, filtering through the dusty haze of Millstone's quiet bustle. Cars rolled by at an unhurried pace, and shopkeepers propped open doors, welcoming in what little foot traffic the town offered. Elias adjusted his watch, a quiet sigh escaping his lips as he glanced back at the Sugar Hill diner. The lingering weight of Charlie's words clung to him, though his face remained impassive. "Folks like you." It wasn't the words themselves, it rarely was. But the tone, the implication. Small-town prejudice always wrapped itself in politeness. Like poison in sugar, Elias had seen it enough to recognize its bitter aftertaste. He strode down the sidewalk toward a building that was unmistakably Millstone's courthouse, an old beige-bricked structure with chipped stone steps and a weathered bronze plaque. Town of Millstone, Justice, Order. Since 1874. The irony wasn't lost on him. David had tried to convince him to avoid this particular meeting. "They won't take kindly to you stirring the pot here, Dr. Cross." But Elias wasn't a man who turned away from challenges, especially ones rooted in the very barriers he had spent his life breaking down. Today, he would meet with local officials to finalize his plans for a new youth medical center, a project aimed at giving back to towns like Millstone, the forgotten places where opportunity rarely knocked. As Elias reached the steps, a voice called out behind him, "Sir!" He turned to see two uniformed police officers approaching, their pace brisk and their expressions unreadable. The older of the two, a stout man with a graying mustache, held up a hand to stop Elias where he stood. "Morning," Elias greeted calmly, though he already sensed where this was going. "Hold on a second there," the officer said, scanning Elias's appearance, his well-cut suit, the leather bag in hand. "You headed somewhere, sir?" Elias glanced briefly at the courthouse doors. "I have a meeting inside." "With who?" The second officer, younger and more rigid, narrowed his eyes as though Elias's presence were cause for suspicion. Elias's brow ticked upward, his composure unshaken. "I don't see why that's relevant." The older officer stepped closer, squinting. "Well, we don't get many visitors like yourself, and we just want to make sure you're not lost." Visitors like yourself. There it was again, coded, unmistakable. Elias's grip on the leather bag tightened subtly, though his face remained a mask of calm. "I assure you, I know exactly where I'm going." The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, his hand resting lightly on the radio strapped to his shoulder. "We're just doing our job? Sir, mind showing us some ID?" Elias exhaled softly, forcing back the wave of irritation building beneath his measured exterior. He had spent a lifetime proving himself to people like this, convincing them he belonged. Doctors didn't often have to pull out their identification to enter a courthouse. Then again, Elias thought grimly, he wasn't the kind of doctor they pictured. "I don't think that's necessary." Elias's voice remained calm, clipped. "As I said, I'm here for a meeting, scheduled, expected, and official." The older officer shifted his weight, lips thinning into a line of skepticism. "You're refusing to show ID?" "No," Elias replied evenly, though his patience was thinning. "I'm questioning why I'm being asked in the first place." Tension crackled in the air between them, like a wire pulled too tight. The younger officer's jaw hardened, his posture turning stiffer. "If you've got nothing to hide, there's no harm in complying, sir." Elias's gaze sharpened, though his tone remained polite. "Let's not do this." "Is there a problem here?" A new voice broke through. Elias turned to see a man in his late 40s descending the courthouse steps. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharply pressed suit, the man moved with an authority that the two officers seemed to recognize instantly. "Mr. Whitman," the older officer greeted, nodding quickly. The man, Deputy Mayor Frank Whitman, Elias recalled from his briefing, fixed his eyes on Elias. His smile was thin and guarded, but it was there. "Gentlemen, I believe Dr. Cross here is expected." The officers stiffened, glancing at each other before stepping back. "Just making sure everything's in order," the older one muttered. "Everything's fine," Whitman said curtly, before turning his attention to Elias. "My apologies, Dr. Cross, small-town diligence, I'm afraid." Elias gave a curt nod, though he could still feel the officers' lingering gazes on his back as Whitman gestured for him to follow. Inside the courthouse, the temperature dropped slightly, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Whitman led Elias down a long hallway lined with framed portraits of stern-faced men, previous mayors, judges, and councilmen, all of them white. "Forgive the welcome committee," Whitman said, glancing sidelong at Elias. "People here can be wary of unfamiliar faces." Elias smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not unfamiliar, Mr. Whitman, just unrecognized." Whitman let out a dry chuckle. "Fair enough." They reached a door at the end of the hall, and Whitman pushed it open, revealing a small wood-paneled meeting room. A long table sat at its center, surrounded by chairs. A few men and women were already seated, their quiet conversations tapering off as Elias entered the room. Elias noted the subtle shift in posture, the way some of their eyes swept over him with cautious curiosity. He was used to this dance, walking into spaces where his presence disrupted expectations. The calm, professional black man in an expensive suit always elicited one of two responses: guarded politeness or thinly veiled discomfort. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman announced, "this is Dr. Elias Cross, the man behind the proposed medical center project." Elias extended a hand as introductions made their way around the room: council members, planning officials, and one older man with a crooked name tag that simply read, Reeves. Reeves didn't stand when Elias reached him, only offered a brief grunt of acknowledgement before leaning back in his chair. Elias took his seat at the head of the table, placing his leather bag down carefully. "Thank you all for meeting with me today. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss what I believe will be an invaluable addition to your community." Whitman smiled tightly, retaking his seat as well. "We're eager to hear your proposal, Dr. Cross. You'll find we're all very invested in what's best for Millstone." Elias offered a nod, though something about Whitman's tone set his teeth on edge. As he began his presentation, Elias kept his voice steady and assured. He laid out plans for the youth medical center, state-of-the-art facilities, mentorship programs, free clinics for underinsured families. His words were clear, his vision undeniable. But as he spoke, he couldn't help but notice the small things: Reeves tapping his pen against the table, eyes drifting to the ceiling, as though feigning boredom. A councilwoman flipping through her papers, looking anywhere but at Elias. "And who exactly will be using this facility?" Reeves's voice broke through suddenly, sharp and edged. Elias paused, turning his attention fully to the man. "The center will be open to everyone. Children, families, anyone in need of care." Reeves's lip curled slightly. "Well, you say everyone. But I imagine it'll attract certain groups more than others." The room fell silent. Elias's heartbeat quickened, though his face remained composed. "Healthcare doesn't discriminate, Mr. Reeves," he said evenly. Reeves shrugged, his smile thin. "Maybe not, but I think we all know what happens when you start attracting outsiders to a quiet town like this." The words hit harder than a slap. Elias's fingers curled against the table's edge, his jaw tightening as the room's silence grew heavier. Whitman's smile faltered, his discomfort plain, but he didn't intervene. Elias leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Reeves. "Respectfully, Mr. Reeves, I'm not here to disrupt this town, I'm here to improve it. Health and opportunity don't take sides, and neither should we." The councilwoman finally looked up, something shifting in her expression. Reeves said nothing, though his face remained stony. The tension hung in the air, thick and stifling, until Whitman finally cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Well, Dr. Cross, your proposal certainly gives us a lot to think about," he said, his voice too bright, too eager to smooth over the discomfort. Elias knew what that meant. Another delay, another polite brush-off. He rose slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Take all the time you need, but understand this. Opportunity doesn't come around often, and it doesn't wait. This center will happen. With or without your support." Whitman's smile faltered, and for the first time, Elias saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Elias collected his bag, nodded to the room, and strode out. Behind him, the quiet murmurs began again. Soft, insidious, and far too familiar. Out on the courthouse steps, the sun shone brighter now, though it did little to warm him. Elias exhaled, steadying the storm swirling inside him. He had expected resistance. He always did. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The hum of the courthouse hallway still echoed faintly in Elias's ears as he made his way down the front steps. His shoes clacked with a precision that matched his thoughts, measured, deliberate, and laced with frustration. The meeting had gone exactly as he had expected. Layers of veiled prejudice masked by polite smiles and excuses. But what simmered beneath the surface was something darker, something systemic, and Elias had felt it clawing at him from the moment he walked into town. As he stepped toward his car, a voice stopped him cold. "Hold it right there, sir." Elias turned sharply, to find the two police officers from earlier approaching. Officer Grady, graying, stout, and unyielding. And his younger partner, Officer McMillan, whose hand now hovered too close to his belt. Elias felt it instantly. The energy had shifted. This wasn't another friendly inquiry. This was something worse. "Is there a problem?" Elias asked, his tone calm but edged with warning. Grady's lips curled into something that might have been mistaken for a smile. "Afraid so. We've had a report about some suspicious activity. Someone matching your description's been seen prowling around here. Mind telling us what you're up to?" Elias felt his heart pound once, hard, before settling into a familiar rhythm of restraint. "I just came out of a scheduled meeting with the town council. If you want confirmation, I suggest you ask Deputy Mayor Whitman." "That's so?" Grady said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer. "Funny no one's mentioned anything about you being on the schedule." Elias studied him carefully. He could feel the heat of passing stairs, curious pedestrians pausing mid-stride, drivers slowing their cars as they passed. This wasn't about suspicion, it was about spectacle, and Grady knew it. "I'm not going to entertain this nonsense," Elias said, pulling his keys from his pocket and turning toward the car. "Sir, stop right there." McMillan's voice cut through the air like a whip. Elias froze, his grip tightening on the keys. Slowly, he turned back to face them. McMillan's face was taut, his eyes wide with the unmistakable mix of nerves and authority. Dangerous in equal measure. The young officer's hand now rested on his holstered firearm. Elias's mind raced. He'd seen this play out far too many times, and he knew how quickly things could escalate. A single twitch, a misunderstanding, a bullet. "I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," McMillan ordered, his voice tight. Elias raised his hands, just slightly. A reluctant surrender to the absurdity of it all. "Let's not do this," he said, his voice even. "Call Whitman, confirm my story. This can all be cleared up in 2 minutes." Grady snorted. "Not how this works, son. You don't get to give us orders. Now, I'm asking politely, step away from the vehicle." Elias's patience splintered. "This is harassment and you know it." Grady's smile faltered, his features hardening. "I said step away." The street had grown unnaturally quiet. Elias could feel the eyes on him, judging, waiting. For a brief moment, his mind flashed back to his first day in medical school. He'd arrived at the ivy-covered building in his best shirt, lugging books that weighed more than his pride. Someone had smirked and asked if he was lost. Back then, he had answered with his head bowed, his voice soft. "Not today." Elias lowered his hands slowly and took a single step toward Grady, his voice a steady force of gravity. "Officer, I am Dr. Elias Cross. You know exactly who I am, and you know exactly what I'm doing here. I've given you no reason to harass me, no cause to stop me, and no excuse to escalate this further. So either you make that call, or you put your hands on me, and you explain to the world why a man in a suit walking out of a courthouse was a threat." For a moment, no one moved. The silence pressed down on them like a physical weight. Grady's expression twisted in barely contained anger, but something flickered behind his eyes. Hesitation. And then a voice broke through. "Officers! What's going on here?" Deputy Mayor Whitman emerged from the courthouse, his brow furrowed as he hurried toward them. "Is there a problem?" he asked, glancing between Elias and the 2 officers. Grady stepped back slightly, though his stance remained rigid. "We had a report." "From who?" Whitman cut him off, his tone sharper than Elias had expected. "Dr. Cross is here on official business. If you have questions, you ask me first." Grady's jaw worked silently, but he didn't respond. Finally, Whitman turned to Elias, offering a strained smile. "Apologies, Dr. Cross. I'll see that this doesn't happen again." Elias didn't trust himself to speak immediately. He let the silence hang as he stared at Grady, memorizing the smug lines of the man's face. "This wasn't over, not by a long shot." "I'm fine," Elias said finally, his voice low. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman." Whitman nodded and gestured toward the courthouse. "Perhaps we should reconvene inside." Elias shook his head, his composure returning like armor slipping back into place. "No need, I've said everything I need to say." Without waiting for a response, Elias turned and unlocked his car, sliding into the driver's seat with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't look back as he pulled away, though he could still feel Grady's glare burning into the back of his neck. The silence in the car was suffocating as Elias drove through Millstone's outskirts. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the tension finally bleeding out of him in slow, controlled breaths. The scene replayed in his head on a loop. Grady's smug tone, McMillan's hand on his gun, Whitman's reluctant intervention. He had faced this before. These quiet wars fought in public spaces where power was measured not by truth, but by who held the badge, the gavel, or the keys to the city. Yet every time it happened, the sting was fresh. His phone buzzed from the center console. Without taking his eyes off the road, Elias pressed the hands-free button. "Call David." The line rang twice before David's voice came through, steady as always. "Everything all right, Dr. Cross?" "Not yet," Elias replied, his voice cold with resolve. "I need you to do something for me. Anything. I want a full report on Millstone. Pull everything. Court cases, police complaints, property deeds, anything that so much as smells like corruption." There was a beat of silence. "You planning on stirring the pot?" Elias's jaw tightened. "They've already stirred it. I'm just making sure they see what's at the bottom." David sighed softly, the sound full of understanding. "I'll get on it right away. Where are you headed?" "Back to the hotel," Elias replied. "We're not done here." As the sun began to dip behind Millstone's skyline, casting the town in a wash of deep amber, Elias parked his car in the gravel lot of a small, unassuming inn. The kind of place where no one asked questions, and no one wanted answers. Inside, he paced the length of the room, his mind a relentless tide of strategies and possibilities. This wasn't just about Grady, or the council anymore. This was about the cancer running through this town, the unchecked authority, the whispered biases, the systems designed to keep people like Elias out. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from David. Found something: police incident records and zoning committee ties. You'll want to see this. Elias's eyes narrowed as he read the message, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what David had found yet, but one thing was certain. The next move was his. And he wasn't holding back. Elias sat at the small desk in his hotel room, his laptop open to a flurry of documents and spreadsheets. The glow from the screen flickered faintly against his sharp features, but his expression was carved from stone. David's email had delivered more than Elias had expected, more than he'd hoped. Even police incident records, zoning committee dealings, and property ownership transfers over the past decade painted a clear, damning picture of corruption in Millstone. The threads all connected back to two names: Officer Grady and Deputy Mayor Frank Whitman. It wasn't just the harassment Elias faced earlier. It was bigger than that. Grady had a long history of complaints, reports of racial profiling, unjust arrests, and intimidation tactics against Black and Latino residents. Most of the cases were dismissed or mysteriously disappeared from the records before ever reaching court. Meanwhile, Whitman's fingerprints were all over suspicious land acquisitions. Property belonging to Black families had changed hands under dubious circumstances. Foreclosures, lowball offers, and sudden rezoning rulings that priced people out of their own homes. Whitman's motivations were crystal clear. Now Millstone wasn't resisting change. They were ensuring the right kind of change. The kind that left people like Elias out in the cold. Elias exhaled slowly, leaning back in the stiff wooden chair. His mind turned like a wheel, strategizing, analyzing. Years of medical school and complex surgeries had trained him to remain calm in chaos, to think 3 steps ahead. Even when the stakes were life and death, he would apply the same precision here. A soft knock at the door broke his focus. Elias glanced at the clock, 8:30 p.m. His eyes narrowed. "Who is it?" "It's Mitchell," a voice called through the door, low and uncertain. Elias rose and opened the door to find Mitchell standing there, fidgeting with his hands. Mitchell was the youngest council member, a man in his early 30s with wide, earnest eyes and the perpetual look of someone who wanted to do the right thing but wasn't sure how Elias had noticed him at the earlier meeting, shifting uncomfortably every time Reeves or Whitman spoke. "Mr. Cross," Mitchell began, his voice hushed. "Can I come in?" Elias stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Mitchell glanced nervously around the room, as if half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. "What brings you here?" Elias asked, folding his arms across his chest. Mitchell ran a hand through his disheveled hair, avoiding Elias's gaze. I shouldn't be here. But after what happened today, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "Go on," Elias said, his tone measured. Mitchell swallowed hard. "Look, I know how things work in this town, okay, Whitman, Grady. They're two sides of the same coin. Whitman's been buying up properties and pushing out families for years, all under the table. And Grady, he makes sure no one pushes back." Elias studied him, searching for the sincerity in Mitchell's words. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're the first person I've seen stand up to them." Mitchell's voice cracked slightly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "They run Millstone like it's theirs, controlling who stays, who leaves, who belongs, and anyone who tries to fight back ends up ruined or gone." Elias nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. "What happens next, Mitchell?" Mitchell hesitated, his face pale. "Whitman's calling an emergency council meeting tomorrow morning. They're voting to block your project, claiming community concerns and unsuitability. It's a smokescreen, but it'll give them the authority to shut you down completely." "And Grady?" Elias pressed. Mitchell's lips tightened. "Grady's a wild card. He'll make things personal. That's how he operates." Elias exhaled deeply, the weight of it settling in his chest. "Why are you helping me?" Mitchell met his eyes for the first time. Because I grew up here too, and I'm tired of pretending I don't see what's happening. For the first time that day, Elias felt a flicker of something like hope, a reminder that not everyone could be bought or bullied. He placed a steady hand on Mitchell's shoulder. Thank you for coming forward, but be careful. People like Whitman don't take kindly to dissent. Mitchell nodded, his face resolute. I know, just don't let them win, okay? As Mitchell slipped out into the night, Elias shut the door and turned back to his desk, his resolve hardening. They were trying to shut him out, bury him under excuses and technicalities, but they had underestimated him. They had underestimated his patience, his strategy, and his will to fight. The next morning, Elias drove to the courthouse just as the sun broke through the horizon, its golden light casting long shadows over the empty streets of Millstone. David had called him earlier with an update. Copies of the documents were being prepped and sent to every major news outlet in the state. Elias had one more chance to make his case, to expose the rot at Millstone's core, before Whitman and Grady locked him out completely. As he parked and approached the building, he saw a small crowd gathered near the steps, residents, council members, and others murmuring in hushed tones. The town square was unusually quiet, save for the sharp sound of Elias's shoes striking pavement as he climbed the steps. Standing at the entrance, flanked by two other officers, was Officer Grady. His smug smile was already in place, as if he had been waiting just for Elias. Dr. Cross, Grady said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. Back again so soon? Elias stopped, his face calm. I'm here for the council meeting. Grady's smile widened. Afraid you're not on the guest list this time. Elias arched an eyebrow. Is that so? You'll have to let Whitman know I've brought something for the meeting. He patted the briefcase in his hand, his gaze unwavering. Grady's eyes flickered briefly to the case, the faintest shadow of uncertainty crossing his face, but the smile returned. I'll let him know. In the meantime, we've got questions to ask you. Elias stiffened. Questions? Grady stepped forward, close enough that Elias could smell the stale coffee on his breath. See? Someone filed a report late last night about a disturbance near one of Whitman's properties, vandalism, trespassing. Things of that nature. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Elias's jaw tightened. You're grasping at straws, officer. Am I? Grady's smile turned sharp, predatory. I think it'd be best if you came with us for questioning. Won't take long. Elias didn't move, didn't blink. He knew exactly what this was. A last-ditch effort to humiliate him, to turn public perception against him. You're arresting me? Elias said, his voice low and steady. Grady spread his hands mockingly. Let's not call it an arrest, just a little chat down at the station. The crowd had begun to murmur now, eyes darting between Elias and the officers. Cameras were out, residents recording on their phones, eager to capture the drama. Elias glanced at them, at the fear and confusion in their faces. Grady was daring him to resist, to fight back and give him an excuse to escalate. Elias met Grady's gaze head-on. You think this will stop me? Grady's smile didn't falter. I think you're gonna run out of fight sooner or later, Dr. Cross. Without another word, Elias handed his briefcase to Mitchell, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and wide-eyed. Hold on to this, Elias said softly. Mitchell nodded, gripping the case tightly. I'll make sure it gets to the council. Elias turned back to Grady, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Let's go then. But when this is over, officer, you'll regret every second you wasted trying to stop me. Grady's smile flickered for the briefest moment. Elias stepped forward, hands held out calmly as McMillan approached with handcuffs. The sharp click of metal locking around his wrists echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. The crowd erupted into shouts and murmurs, but Elias's expression didn't waver. He held his chin high, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They wanted to break him, humiliate him, but all they had done was hand him the final piece of the story he needed to tell. As the officers led him down the courthouse steps, cameras still rolling, Elias looked up at the gray sky above and thought, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. The stale air in the police station stung like a slap, thick with the faint smell of old coffee and institutional neglect. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above Elias as he sat in the cramped interrogation room, hands cuffed to the table. A dull ache spread through his wrists from the cheap steel digging into his skin, but he refused to let the discomfort show. He'd been in high-pressure environments before, operating rooms where seconds decided lives. This wasn't new. The stakes here were just as high, but Elias wasn't cutting through flesh this time. He was cutting through a system. The door creaked open, and Officer Grady swaggered in, his broad frame filling the space as though he owned it. He was followed by Deputy Mayor Whitman, whose polished shoes and crisp suit seemed comically out of place in the dingy room. Elias's eyes flicked between the two men, their partnership now blatant, their intentions unmistakable. Grady leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Whitman stepped forward and perched on the edge of the table, his face stretched into a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Dr. Cross," Whitman began, his voice smooth and condescending, "I hope you understand, this little misunderstanding could have been avoided if you'd just kept to your place." Elias held his gaze, his expression unreadable. "My place?" Whitman's smile tightened. "Millstone is a small town. People here don't take kindly to disruption outsiders. People with grand ideas don't usually stick around. I'd hate for your reputation to suffer because of a few unfortunate choices." Elias's jaw ticked, but his voice remained steady. "Unfortunate choices? Like Whitman Investments, acquiring land from displaced families? Or Officer Grady, intimidating residents to keep them quiet? Are those the choices you're referring to?" Whitman's smile faltered just slightly, and Elias caught it. A crack. Grady, meanwhile, pushed off the wall, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," Grady growled. "You think waltzing in here with your fancy suit and big ideas makes you untouchable? This is our town, ours. We built this place." Elias's gaze shifted to Grady, sharp and piercing. "You didn't build anything. You're a parasite feeding off people who don't have the power to fight back." Grady's fists curled at his sides, his face flushing red. "You watch your mouth." Whitman raised a hand, signaling Grady to back off. He turned his attention back to Elias, his tone growing colder. "This medical center of yours? It's finished. The council vote is just a formality at this point. We'll ensure every permit is denied, every appeal ignored, you'll walk away empty-handed, and Millstone will go back to normal." Elias stared at Whitman, the weight of his words sinking in. They were so confident, so assured that they could bury him, as they'd buried so many before him. But this time, they had miscalculated. Elias leaned forward slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "You really believe you can stop me? That you can silence me like everyone else?" Whitman's expression darkened. "I don't believe it. I know it." Elias met his gaze, his words as sharp as a scalpel. "Then you haven't been paying attention." The door burst open so suddenly that it banged against the wall, startling Grady. And Whitman David stood in the doorway, his face calm but his eyes blazing with purpose. Behind him trailed Mitchell, holding Elias's briefcase close to his chest. "Apologies for the interruption, gentlemen," David said smoothly, stepping into the room. "But I believe we've got something you'll want to see." "What the hell is this?" Grady barked, his voice cracking with anger. David ignored him, setting a thick manila folder down on the table in front of Whitman, with a satisfying thud. Mitchell followed, his face pale but determined, as he opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed documents. "These are copies of land deeds, police complaints, and zoning approvals, all linked back to Whitman Investments and your good friend Officer Grady," David said coolly. "It's all here. The intimidation, the forced sales, the pattern of discrimination. And guess what? Deputy Mayor. It's already on its way to the State Attorney General's office and a handful of media outlets." Whitman's face paled, his earlier smugness draining away like water down a cracked pipe. "You can't. This isn't legal." "It absolutely is," David interrupted, his tone icy. "And if you thought Dr. Cross didn't have receipts, you've seriously underestimated him." Grady, now seething, slammed his fist on the table. "This doesn't change anything. You think you can come in here and ruin us? You think anyone will listen to you?" His eyes darted between Elias and David, venom dripping from his words. Elias leaned back in his chair, his posture impossibly calm. They'll listen to the truth, and once the media gets hold of this, you'll both have bigger problems than a medical center." Whitman shot up from the table, his composure finally fracturing. "You don't understand how things work here," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't belong here? You come into our town." Elias cut him off with a quiet, deadly calm. "Your town. No. This town belongs to the people you've spent years crushing beneath your boots, the families you've pushed out, the voices you've silenced. I'm here to make sure they have a chance to fight back." The room fell silent, the weight of Elias's words hanging heavy in the air. Whitman's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes darting to Grady as if seeking backup, but Grady had gone quiet, his fists trembling at his sides. Mitchell stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly but clear. "And I'm done pretending I don't see it." He looked directly at Whitman, the conviction in his voice growing stronger with every word. "You can't bury this anymore, you can't hide it." Whitman's jaw tightened, his shoulders heaving as he seemed to realize the ground had shifted beneath him. "You think this ends here?" he hissed, his voice barely audible. "This isn't over." Elias stood slowly, the chair scraping against the tile floor as he straightened to his full height. He towered over the two men, his gaze steady and unshakable. "You're right about one thing," he said softly. "It's not over, but it's over for you." The door opened again, and a new voice rang out. "Deputy Mayor Whitman, Officer Grady?" Everyone turned as a state investigator stepped into the room, flanked by two uniformed officers. The investigator's gaze swept over the room before landing on Whitman and Grady. "You're both coming with us. There's an inquiry pending, and you'll have a chance to explain yourselves downtown." Grady's face turned a violent shade of red, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the investigator cut him off. "I suggest you come quietly." David stepped aside as the officers moved in. Grady glared at Elias as they cuffed his hands, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "This isn't over. Cross people like you don't win." Elias didn't flinch. He stared Grady down, his voice calm, certain. "We already have." Whitman, now cuffed as well, was silent. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as the weight of his downfall settled on him. He had no more words, no more power. The room that had been his arena was now his prison. As they were let out, Elias turned to Mitchell, who still clutched the open briefcase like a shield. "You did the right thing," Elias said softly. Mitchell nodded, his face ashen but resolute. "I hope it's enough." "It's a start," Elias replied, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had just happened, and everything that was still to come. David placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You ready to step out there?" Elias glanced at him, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Ready as I'll ever be." Together, they walked out of the interrogation room, leaving behind the wreckage of Millstone's corruption. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun rising higher in the sky, a quiet promise of something new. But as the courthouse doors swung open and Elias stepped into the glare of cameras and the shouts of reporters, he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Elias Cross sat in the dimly lit holding room, a space designed to strip dignity from anyone who entered it. A single metal chair, a dented table, and a buzzing overhead light made the room feel suffocating. Yet Elias sat upright, composed as ever. He wasn't broken, he wasn't beaten. He was waiting. The door opened abruptly with a metallic screech. Officer Grady stepped in first, his chest puffed out, as if the air in the room belonged to him. Behind him came Deputy Mayor Frank Whitman, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in sharp contrast to Grady's heavy boots. "Hope you're comfortable, Dr. Cross," Grady sneered, emphasizing the title with mockery. "You might be here a while." Elias didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on Grady, unflinching and steady. "I wasn't aware false arrests were part of Millstone's policies." Grady's smirk deepened, but Whitman raised a hand, signaling for silence as he stepped closer to Elias. The deputy mayor's face was carved into the same smug expression that Elias had seen so many times. Men convinced of their untouchable power. "You don't know when to quit, Dr. Cross," Whitman said quietly, his tone both measured and venomous. "You think a few documents and some noise will bring us down? We run this town. You're not going to change that. Elias tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but sharp. That's your problem, Whitman. You believe you own everything, the land, the rules, the people, but you don't. Whitman's smile cracked just slightly. No one here cares about your vision, your medical center, or your crusade. They care about order, and that means keeping out disruptions. Disruptions? Elias repeated, his voice cold. You mean people like me? The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, unmasking the truth Whitman had carefully tried to wrap in euphemisms. Whitman's eyes flickered briefly, and in that moment, Elias saw the man's veneer crumble. You don't belong here, Whitman said finally, his voice dropping lower, venom dripping from every syllable. Men like you show up, thinking you can throw money at a place like this and fix it, but Millstone doesn't need fixing, it needs people who know their place. Elias felt his chest tighten, the words stoking the slow-burning fire he had kept carefully controlled. He stood slowly, his calm, deliberate movements causing Grady to flinch slightly. Know their place, Elias repeated, his voice deadly quiet. Let me tell you something, Whitman. I do know my place. It's in an operating room saving lives you couldn't comprehend. It's building opportunities for people you've spent your life pushing into the margins. And today, my place is here, standing in your way. Whitman's face flushed red. You arrogant! Elias cut him off, his words hitting like a hammer. No, I'm done listening to you. You and Grady have built your power on fear, intimidation, and corruption. But that's over now. You think this ends with me locked in here, with a failed project. I know the people you've stolen from, the families you've forced out, and now the state attorney general knows too. Whitman's expression faltered. What are you talking about? Elias smiled faintly, the steel in his gaze unwavering. Your crimes are out in the open now. Documents, testimonies, connections. It's all gone public. The media is already asking questions you can't answer. You don't control the narrative anymore. Grady's fists clenched as he stepped forward, his voice a growl. You're bluffing, nobody's listening to you. I don't bluff, Elias shot back, locking eyes with him. And you're not nearly as untouchable as you think. You're a bully, Grady, a man hiding behind a badge, drunk on power. But power isn't the same as respect, and when the people you claim to protect realize who you are, what you are, you'll lose everything. Grady lunged, slamming his hands on the table, his face inches from Elias's. You shut your mouth. But Elias didn't move, didn't blink. He looked at Grady as though he were nothing more than an obstacle, temporary and irrelevant. You've spent your life intimidating people who couldn't fight back. I'm not afraid of you, and that terrifies you, doesn't it? Grady froze, his face contorted with anger, but his body rigid, as if Elias had struck something inside him. For the first time, the cracks in his armor were visible. Whitman's phone buzzed suddenly, slicing through the tension like a blade. He pulled it from his pocket, frowning as he glanced at the screen. His face went pale. What is it? Grady demanded. Whitman ignored him, fumbling to read the incoming news alert. Elias didn't need to see the screen to know what it said. He had prepared for this moment. Every document David sent, every piece of evidence Mitchell handed over. It had all been timed perfectly. What did I tell you? Elias said softly, his voice like the calm before a storm. The truth has a way of coming to light. Whitman spun toward Grady, his voice sharp and panicked. We need to contain this now. Grady's bravado faltered as he glanced between Whitman and Elias, clearly realizing that something had shifted. The walls were closing in, and they knew it. The door swung open, and a uniformed officer entered, one Elias hadn't seen before. He looked young, nervous, but determined, as he held up a clipboard. Sir, he said, addressing Grady. We just got word from Central Command. The AG's office sent investigators. They're demanding all internal reports and records on file. Grady's face turned crimson. What? Who gave them? Everything's already been flagged, sir, the officer continued, his voice cracking. They're here now. Elias allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction as Grady turned on Whitman, his composure finally shattering. What the hell did you do? Whitman rounded on Elias, his voice trembling with fury. You don't know what you've started. I know exactly what I've started, Elias replied, stepping forward until he was face to face with the deputy mayor. And I know how it ends. Whitman's mask crumbled completely, his voice a furious snarl. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? Elias stared him down, his voice calm and steady. It changes everything. At that moment, two state investigators appeared in the doorway, their presence signaling the end of Whitman and Grady's reign. One of the investigators nodded toward Elias as he gestured to the two men. Deputy Mayor Whitman, Officer Grady, you'll need to come with us. Grady backed up a step, his chest heaving, but Whitman knew the fight was over. He turned back to Elias, his eyes full of hatred and desperation. This isn't over. Elias held his gaze, unflinching. For you, it is. As the investigators led Whitman and Grady out, the air in the room shifted, the weight of their corruption beginning to lift. Elias stood tall, his heartbeat finally slowing as the door shut behind them. David appeared moments later, his face splitting into a grin. It's done. The press is swarming, and the AG is already assembling the case. Elias nodded, allowing the words to settle in. Good. You okay? David asked, his voice softer now. Elias exhaled deeply, his expression softening as he looked at his friend. I will be. The fight wasn't over, not completely. There would be hearings, investigations, and cleanup. But the system that Whitman and Grady had spent years building was collapsing under the weight of its own rot. And Elias Cross had struck the first blow. As he stepped out of the station into the blinding morning sun, the town of Millstone seemed quieter, lighter somehow. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and questions flew, but Elias moved through them with the steady composure of a man who had already won the battle. His fight wasn't just about a medical center. It was about standing against a system built to exclude people like him. It was about breaking that system, brick by brick. And for the first time in a long time, Elias knew the tide was turning. The morning sun spread across Millstone like a cleansing fire, spilling over the courthouse steps where reporters clamored, their voices echoing off the aging stone facade. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and the crowd swelled with townspeople. Some curious, others cautious. They had all heard the news by now. Elias Cross stood at the center of it, the man who had refused to back down. David stood beside him, his phone buzzing non-stop with messages and calls from media outlets and officials across the state. They're digging through everything, he muttered. Land deals, zoning bribes, police intimidation. It's all unraveling. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the street. Across the square, he spotted families watching quietly. Some he recognized from David's reports, people who had lost their homes, their businesses, their trust. Grady and Whitman had held this town in a chokehold for years, but now their power was cracking like a dam under pressure. Mitchell appeared from the crowd, his face flushed but triumphant. They've officially suspended Grady from the force, Whitman stepping down voluntarily pending investigation. He shook his head, a small smile pulling at his lips. They're done. The AG's office will take it from here. And the council? Elias asked, his tone measured, though something hopeful stirred beneath it. Mitchell nodded. They've agreed to reopen the vote on your medical center. With Whitman out of the picture, it'll pass. You did it. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening for the first time in days. He looked at Mitchell, this hesitant man who had risked so much to stand up against the system. We did it, Elias corrected, his voice firm. None of this happens without people like you. Mitchell's smile faltered slightly, as if the weight of it all had only now hit him. I should have spoken up sooner. Elias placed a steady hand on his shoulder. What matters is that you did change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a choice, one person at a time. Mitchell nodded, his eyes clearer than they'd been before. The town square buzzed with a low murmur as Elias stepped forward, facing the press. He rarely sought the spotlight. His victories were usually measured in steady heartbeats on an operating table, in second chances gifted to strangers, but this moment demanded something else. The reporters turned, their questions colliding in a frantic wave. Dr. Cross, what will happen to the project now? Did you anticipate this level of corruption? How do you respond to the people who claim you disrupted the town? Elias raised a hand, and the noise fell to a hush. I came to Millstone with one goal, to build something that could serve this community," he said, his voice steady, but carrying. "But what I discovered here runs deeper than one project. The corruption, the intimidation, the abuse of power. It's been allowed to fester for years because people were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to fight back." The crowd shifted, whispers passing between them like a breeze. Elias continued, "Change doesn't come easily, it's uncomfortable. It disrupts, but it's necessary. I didn't come here to divide this town. I came here because I know what it means to be overlooked, to be told you don't belong, to watch opportunity pass you by." He scanned the faces in the crowd, pausing briefly on a young black boy standing with his mother. The boy's wide eyes reflected something Elias recognized: hope. "Millstone deserves better," Elias said firmly. "And it's not just about me or this project. It's about every family that's been forced out, every voice that's been silenced. It's about the future you're building for your children, and the kind of town you want them to grow up in." There was a long pause before the crowd began to shift again. This time not with whispers, but with nods, murmurs of agreement. David leaned closer to Elias, his voice low. "You're winning them over." "It's not about winning," Elias murmured back. "It's about waking them up." Later that afternoon, the council reconvened in a packed chamber. Residents filled the seats, their energy a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Mitchell sat at the table, visibly more confident now as he presented Elias's proposal again, this time without interference. When the final vote passed unanimously, the room erupted into applause. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to smile. David slapped him on the back. "You pulled it off, they couldn't ignore you anymore." Elias looked around the room, his chest swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now: triumph. But beneath it lay a somber understanding. This victory wasn't just his. It was for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or left behind. The following morning, Elias stood at the empty lot where the medical center would soon rise. The ground was still uneven, the soil hardened by years of neglect. But Elias could see it already. The walls going up, the hum of construction, the future taking shape where decay had once thrived. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see the young boy from the town square standing a few feet away, his mother watching from the sidewalk. "Hey there," Elias said gently, crouching down to meet the boy's curious gaze. The boy fidgeted for a moment before asking, "Are you the doctor who's building the big building?" Elias smiled. "That's me." "Is it for us?" the boy asked quietly. Elias's throat tightened as he nodded. "It's for you and everyone who needs it, a place where people can come to heal, to learn, to grow." The boy's face lit up with a smile that was pure and bright, unburdened by the weight his parents had likely carried for years. He turned and ran back to his mother, shouting, "He's the one! Mama! He's the one building it!" Elias stood, watching them walk away, and felt the ache in his chest soften. This was what the fight had been for. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Whitman and Grady were removed from their positions, their corruption becoming front-page news across the state. Investigations expanded into other departments, and residents began to speak out about injustices they had buried for years. The foundation of Millstone's power structure was cracking, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was finally heading somewhere new. As for Elias, he returned to his work in the city, his surgical practice, his mentorship programs, and now, the Millstone project construction had broken ground, and Elias received updates daily, each photo of progress a testament to what could be accomplished when people refused to back down. Sitting in his office one evening, Elias stared out at the city skyline, the lights shimmering like stars. David entered quietly, placing a new stack of reports on the desk. "Millstone's making progress," he said. "They're launching a review of the entire zoning board, and Grady, he's facing federal charges." Elias nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good. Let's hope it sticks." David sat across from him, studying his friend. "You know, you didn't just build a center, Elias. You built a spark. That town will never be the same." Elias looked at David, his gaze soft but steady. "It's not about me. It's about what comes next, what they build now that they know they can fight back." David smiled. What about you? What comes next for you? Elias leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. There's always another fight, another town, another system to fix, but for now, I'll keep building. Outside, the world moved on, but something had shifted. Something small, but vital. Change didn't come all at once. It started with a spark, a choice, a man who refused to know his place, and Elias Cross would keep going, brick by brick, until the walls came down. The sound of hammers and drills echoed through the air as the construction site in Millstone bustled with energy. Workers moved across the newly laid foundation, their movements purposeful, their faces lit with something close to pride. Elias Cross stood at the edge of the site, a white hard hat resting under his arm as he surveyed the progress. Steel beams rose against the morning sky like exclamation marks, tangible proof of what resilience could build. He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. This was more than a building. It was a promise. The events of the past month had left scars, visible and invisible. Grady and Whitman's downfall had sent shockwaves through Millstone, revealing the rot that had festered beneath the town's surface for far too long. For years, corruption and quiet prejudice had been allowed to take root, driving families out, silencing voices, and feeding a system that thrived on fear. Elias had seen these patterns before, in other towns, other faces, but Millstone had been personal. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, but when it found him, he knew he couldn't look away. Days after the state investigators swept in, reporters had swarmed Millstone like bees to honey, eager to expose the cracks Elias and his team had uncovered. The documents David assembled were damning. Bribes, illegal land deals, and police misconduct stretching back more than a decade. Whitman's polished veneer had shattered under the weight of his lies, while Grady, the town's enforcer, was left with nothing but a badge, stripped of its authority, and a reputation stained beyond repair. Their downfall hadn't just been about corruption, it was about accountability, about showing the people of Millstone that power didn't have to go unchecked, and for Elias, it had been a reckoning. The morning after his release from police custody, he'd looked in the mirror and seen the toll it had taken. The sleepless nights, the raw anger, the steady resolve that had carried him forward. It had been tempting, in those moments, to let the bitterness consume him, to ask why he had to fight battles like this, again and again. But then he remembered the faces, the families who'd lost their homes, the workers who whispered their fears in hushed tones, the young boy in the square, his wide-eyed hope breaking through the haze of indifference. For them, the fight wasn't optional. It was survival. "You okay?" David's voice pulled Elias back to the present. He turned to find his friend standing beside him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Elias took one with a faint smile. "I'm good," Elias replied softly, looking back at the construction site. "Better than good." David nodded, leaning on the fence as he followed Elias's gaze. "They're moving fast. That foundation'll be ready for walls in a few weeks." Elias took a sip of his coffee, the warmth cutting through the chill. "Progress," he murmured. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." David studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, you didn't just change this town, you changed the way they see themselves. People are talking now, asking questions they were too afraid to ask before." "That's what happens when you shine a light," Elias replied. "People realize they're not alone in the dark." David smirked faintly. "Poetic as always, Dr. Cross." Elias chuckled, though his eyes remained serious. "It's not just about Millstone, though this happens everywhere. David. Every town has its Grady, its Whitman people in power who think they can rewrite the rules and decide who belongs. This place is just one example of something much bigger." David nodded, his face thoughtful. "So what now? You planning to take this fight to the next town?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I do know this. What we started here won't end with me. People are paying attention, others will stand up. If Millstone can change, so can any place." David watched him, admiration clear in his gaze. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Elias grinned faintly. "I've been told." Later that afternoon, Elias visited the community center, where Millstone's residents had gathered for a town hall meeting. The room was packed. Men and women, young and old, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Some faces were wary, others hopeful. Change, Elias knew, came with uncertainty. It didn't happen overnight. As Elias stepped to the front of the room, a hush fell over the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," Elias began, his voice steady. "When I first came to Millstone, I saw a town that had been forgotten. A place where opportunity was for the few, not the many. And I saw people who were told their voices didn't matter, that their struggles didn't matter." He paused, letting his words settle. "But you proved them wrong. This town doesn't belong to the Whitmans and the Gradys of the world. It belongs to you, the families who've lived here for generations, the workers who keep it running, the children who deserve to grow up knowing that they matter." There were murmurs of agreement, heads nodding across the room. "This medical center is just the beginning," Elias continued. "It's not a solution to every problem, but it's a step toward something better. And it's not mine. It's yours." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze landing on familiar faces. Mitchell, now sitting straighter, with a newfound confidence. The young boy and his mother from the square, smiling quietly from the back. Workers from the site, parents, teachers, all of them gathered in the same room, no longer silent. "You have a choice now," Elias said, his voice rising slightly. "To demand more, to hold people accountable, to speak up when something isn't right. Change isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it starts here, with all of you." Applause filled the room, growing louder as people rose to their feet. Elias stepped back, his heart full. For the first time since arriving in Millstone, he felt something shift, like the first cracks of light breaking through a long, dark night. That evening, Elias sat on the hood of his car, parked just outside the construction site. The town stretched out behind him, quiet now, but full of possibility. His phone buzzed beside him, a text from David. "Press wants a statement, you ready for the spotlight?" Elias smirked faintly, typing back, "The work speaks for itself." He looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. The fight wasn't over. Not here, not anywhere. The Whitmans and Gradys of the world would always exist, but so would the people willing to stand against them. People like Mitchell, like the families of Millstone. People like him. Elias had spent his life breaking barriers, first in classrooms, then in operating rooms, and now here, in a small town that had once tried to push him out. But he wasn't leaving. Not this time. He slipped off the hood of his car and walked back toward the construction site. The skeleton of the medical center stood before him, unfinished, imperfect, but solid. And Elias Cross would keep building, brick by brick, until the walls came down,